For our closing remarks, please welcome the author of The Innovator's Dilemma, Professor Clay Christensen.
Again, I'm just overwhelmed by the excitement and the capability to be innovative. As you know, sustaining innovations, whose purpose is to make good products better, we've been good at doing sustaining innovations for a very long time. But disruptive innovations are ones that transform services or products which historically were not available to most people. And by making them affordable and accessible, they become available to many, many more. And it's these kinds of disruptive innovations that transform the world that we're in. I mentioned a couple of years ago that there are 3 institutions that merit more focus in disruptive innovation, and they are religion, which in many ways is losing its force in our economies, parenting. So many of the best in our society are outsourcing parenting to others when we need to interpret, we need to take responsibility to ourselves to this. And then there's terrorism. And I thought I'd tell you a story about the last that has taught me something quite useful about theories. And as you know, the theory of disruption is a theory. A theory is a statement of causality, a statement of what causes what and why. A number of years ago, 1999, I think, I was in my office, and just out of the blue, I received a call from Secretary William Cohen, who was the Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration. I'd never met the man, but just out of the blue, he called me up. And he said, I read this book you wrote about disruption. I wondered if you would be willing to come down to the Pentagon and talk to my staff about the idea. Well, for me, it's a chance of a lifetime, you know, and I had been in the Secretary's office a couple of times when I was worked in the Reagan administration. So I had a sense of what he meant by the staff. They have several majors and college second lieutenants and college interns and whatever. So I showed up there, and as Secretary Cohen introduced me into his conference room, there on the front row were the chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I realized, oh, that's what you mean by staff. And then behind them were the secretaries of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Commandant of the Marine Corps. Behind them were the undersecretaries and deputy secretaries of defense. And behind them were all of the assistant secretaries of everything else. And there are about 40 people there. And Secretary Cohen said to me, you've got to understand, this is the first time since I began serving as secretary when I've been able to assemble my whole staff. So then I said, what do you want me to do? And he said, oh, just present your junk. That was a quote. And so I did. I had a presentation about disruption, and I had 2 slides. And the first one just laid out the basic idea, and that is, in every market, there are trajectories of improvement that innovating companies provide. And most innovations make good products better, sustaining innovations. But what makes it innovations that make products affordable and accessible, we call disruptive innovations. And I described that they always start at the simplest end of the market, solving simple problems for simple people. And from that environment, it moves up step by step to be able to do more and more. And the leaders in the markets have a hard time going down because their path for profit always is to make good products better from where they are. And it's these kinds of innovations that come in at the bottom of the market that transform industries. And then after I described this theory, I said, now let me explain how this works with a very different industry application than you'd imagine, and that is steel. And I did it just so that they could visualize this in an abstract way. And so I described how in the steel industry, like every industry, there are tiers in the market. At the bottom of the market are simple products. And in this case, it was concrete reinforcing bar or rebar. And then there are other tiers in the market, but the most demanding tier is sheet steel that is used to make cars and appliances. Very hard to make. And that was what the market is structured by. And then I described how the integrated steel companies like US Steel and Bethlehem used to make the whole range of these products. But a new technology embedded in a new business model that we call mini mills were disruptive. And they came in at the bottom of the market. And the way they made steel was they melted scrap in electric furnaces. And because they were melting scrap, the quality that they could produce was very limited. And in fact, the only market that would buy what the mini mills made was the rebar industry, because there are almost no specs for rebar in the first place. And then once you buried it in cement, you couldn't verify if it had met spec or not. And so rebar was a perfect market for crummy products. But then I described how those mini mills went better and better and better and better until today the mini mills account for about 65% of all steel made in North America. And all but one of the integrated steel companies has gone bankrupt. Well, after I finished that story, General Shelton, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time, put his hand up. And he said, "Clay, you're clueless about why we're interested in this stuff." And I said, "I am clueless." And he said, "Well, let me explain." And he went up to the diagram. And he said, "You know what you say is the most demanding tier of the market as sheet steel in that industry. In our industry," he said, "that's the Russians. They historically have been the most demanding problem that we've had to defend against." And then he described what you call as the integrated steel companies like US Steel. He said, "That's us, the US Department of Defense. And everything that we're doing is targeted at helping us contain the war against the Russians." And then he looked at the bottom of the market, and he said, the low end of the sheet market, or of the steel market, is rebar. For us, that's terrorism. And what you call as the mini mills coming up from the bottom, we call non-nation nations like Al-Qaeda. And he said there isn't anything about how we're organized to execute our mission with the Russians. There isn't anything about it that allows us to succeed at terrorism. And then he sat down, and all of the hands in the room went up. And for 2 hours, they were throwing questions at me and with each other and arguing against each other around is this disruption happening in our world? And one of the most early questions that was asked was, has there been any instance of a company that was the leader in their industry when they were disrupted by something from the bottom? Is there an instance where the leader stayed as the leader? And I said there are a few, but in every case, they succeeded by setting up a completely different business unit and giving it a charter to disrupt the parent. And that's the only time when it has happened. And a few times in the discussion, I'd say, guys, look, I just have 4 more slides. Can I finish the presentation? But they always needed to come back. Anyway, it lasted for about 2 hours. Within 2 months, they had decided to set up a different organization in the Defense Department. They had the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and then this new one, which was called the Special Forces Command. And its charter was to create a completely different business model to go after this disruption in our space. So I've thought about this a long time. As those of you who know me know that Clayton Christensen is the most average of average men. Totally on every dimension, totally average. Given that, why in the world would the Secretary of Defense call Clayton Christensen in the first place? And what was even crazier was why would all of those people who knew more about offense and defense than any people alive, why would they ask Clayton Christensen questions? And what was even crazier was why would they take notes about the answers that I gave? And then I realized it had nothing to do with the averageness of Clay Christensen. But there was a theory, one of several that have emerged from my research, and this theory of disruption was there, and the theory had voice, and the theory had logic, and a logic of cause and effect. A theory has experience. This disruption has happened over and over again in industry after industry, decade after decade. The theory has experience. This is the first time that disruption has occurred in defense. And because of that, the logic and the language and the understanding of causality had great effect. Clay Christensen didn't, but the theory did. And that changed my life because I don't need to be anything more than an average person. But if we can have an understanding of causality in the problems that we're trying to address, and if we take the time to be sure that everybody involved understands the statement of causality that is articulated in these theories, we can have a great impact. Now, what happened subsequently is in 2011, the current president and his staff decided to shut down this Special Forces Command and take the missions that had been there and stuck them back into the Army, Navy, and the Air Force, and asked those institutions to engage with terrorism. And so there we are, trying to counter terrorism with F-34s. And I don't bemoan what's happened, but the reason why it happened is that the people who decided that the core structure of this effort can be addressed by the same organization that was designed to beat the Russians. And they did it because they don't have a theory. And so they did the best that they could do given what they understood. And it taught me a really important lesson, that as we have movements which are shown here today, my goodness, we have to be sure that we, along with our innovation, we have a theory that is understood by all, so that these kinds of innovations can move and change the world as we want them to change the world. Well, thanks so much, you guys, for being a part of the team. And may God bless all of you.